Take hands and off we go. 1 e4 and Magnus goes solid with e5. We have the Italian and now d3 knight f6 quickly castled here and Magnus also castles. You have h3 played here by Hans and Magnus just getting into the groove of the game, pushes his pawn to h6 as well. So very solid opening chosen by both the players, and Magnus just adjusts his knight, pushes his pawn to d6. Now d4 is possible, but he first begins with rook e1, defending the pawn and getting ready for the slow maneuvering of the knight to f1 to g3. a6 played here by Magnus. He would like to put his bishop back on a7. He brings his rook to e8. Knight goes back to f1. And now bishop a7. So slow and steady maneuvering happening in the game. Niemann slightly quicker than Magnus in this opening phase, but now taking his time to think what should be his next move. And he brings his knight out to g3. Bishop comes into e6. He takes. Rook takes on e6. And now somewhere you want to push d4, but you want to do it at the right time. Oh, he pushes right away. And now Magnus has this very interesting move, d5, when all the pawns are opposite each other and the game kind of equalizes there. But not so easy to decide on this move. You can see Magnus taking his time because there's a clear threat to push the pawn to d5. The rook goes back. And now Hans brings his bishop to e3. Magnus takes. And he takes back with the bishop, making sure that this pawn is defended by his knight and rook against the two attacks there on e4. But in this way, you are giving up your important bishop. However, Hans realizes that in return he will get this very strong central structure. So Magnus has a decision to make. Should he take on d4 or not? If he does not take, then maybe white is happy with what has developed here. Also, the knight could at any point jump to f5, look at these key squares, and the queen could move up. I like white's chances here overall. And Magnus also burning time here. He has now 1 minute 30 seconds. He's actually a minute down on the clock. Takes with the pawn and plays c6. You can see white has this beautiful structure. Hans brings his queen to b3, putting pressure on the b7 point, planning to bring the rook in. Rook goes to b8, brings the rook in. Look at this, white's position, a picture of harmony here. Magnus Carlsen has some important decisions to make. Also, he must keep an eye on his time. He's coming down to a minute on the clock, while Hans Niemann has 2.5 minutes. This is looking very stressful. He goes rook e6. Maybe his plan is queen e7, rook e8, trying to put pressure on the e4 point. He comes back with his queen to c2. And now Magnus would love to play queen e7, but the knight would jump into f5, attacking the queen. So he must think about it, but he's unable to make quick decisions. He's burning a lot of time now, down to 40 seconds on the clock. Oh my goodness, he goes g6. Now this does weaken the kingside structure a bit, and Hans instantly attacks the pawn on h6. Magnus has to decide king g7, king h7. He goes king to g7. And now the queen moves into f4. The queen is well positioned, looking at f6, also at h6, threatening knight f5, and the speed at which Hans Niemann is playing this is absolutely insane. Not often do you see Magnus Carlsen under so much pressure. Queen e7 played. He has just 23 seconds left. Now knight h4 with the idea of knight f5 check. King moves to h7. A logical move there. He comes back, knight to f3, offering to Magnus whether he wants to repeat. Magnus says not really. e5 was a little too rushed. He's playing on his time. Magnus jumps in with his knight to d5. And now all of a sudden, black's position starts to look pretty okay because the knight is so well positioned here. It was a bit too hasty by Hans to push his pawn to e5, but he saw that Magnus had just 20 seconds on his clock and rushed in. Takes the pawn, rook takes pawn here, and now this is not a great move because you can just move in with the queen to b4, but Magnus hardly has time. He's down to already 15 seconds. He finds bishop b8, which is not the best move. It kind of helps white to equalize here after rook takes e6, queen takes e6, and a move like rook d2. He takes, queen takes, and now first trade with the queen. Trade the queens, but Hans would want to play on Magnus's time. If he trades queens, then Magnus can continue quite easily. But on the other hand, where do you move your queen? Oh, he goes to h4. And now queen e7, offering a trade of queens here. Maybe Magnus would be okay with a draw here if queen g4, but he trades queens, goes to knight f1. But now you can see Magnus Carlsen is a beast in such positions. This is endgame territory. This is his territory. And you don't mess with Magnus in such positions. Bishop comes to a7, and he's keeping an eye on the d4 pawn, brings back his rook. He's down to 15 seconds on the clock, but this one is just easy for Magnus to play because he's just so good. Knight to c4, goes rook d7, putting pressure here, and he reorganizes his pieces beautifully. Knight e6, now 4 attackers here, goes back knight c2, pawn to f5. Just moving his pieces, just doesn't need to think. King e2, king comes up. Wow, the way in which Magnus is playing here is just epic. King comes up to d3, pawn to c5, pushes his pawn, opening up this, and here you are actually losing the pawn. Hans Niemann does not have a way to cling on to this pawn anymore. If he comes up, there's also the b5 check that could come in. Oof. Wow. And just like that, Magnus has raced up to 20 seconds on the clock. King c3, he takes the pawn. And now do you want to take everything? Knight to g5 played here by Magnus, attacking the pawn but also threatening knight e4 check, and the f2 pawn is falling. Wow. And now Hans Niemann is running below Magnus's time. Magnus has 22 seconds. Hans is running below 20 seconds. Wow. What a turnaround this has been. Absolutely crazy. Just goes to show how dangerous Magnus Carlsen really is. Rook f1 played. That's not a move you make happily in any case. King comes to d3. Hans just down to 7 seconds on the clock. Magnus knows that he has the opponent by the neck. King goes back to e2, moves into a4, attacking the pawn here, also attacking the knight on d4. He brings his knight back, check, king comes here, knight takes pawn, and this is already completely winning for white, for black. It's completely awesome. Knight goes back with a check, king c2, and now he brings back his knight to c5. Magnus Carlsen keeping his time at 19 seconds. He's been doing this for over 20 moves now. Absolutely crazy. Knight to b3. And do you now trade one pair of knights? That would mean some ease for black. But no. Magnus is like, I want to keep playing on the king side. Brings his bishop back to b8. Attacking this pawn. g4. Knight jumps into f4. The rook comes in. And he has his bishop now entering on a good square. The king moves back. Do you want to take this pawn? But then rook h1 attacks here. So rook c7. He brings his rook in. Rook comes up and takes the pawn. Knight jumps in, attacking the b7 pawn, also threatening a check. These knights are pesky creatures. Magnus has to be, he takes another pawn. Check, king here, check. King goes back. And now he takes the pawn. King comes up again, threatening. Wow, a triangulation here in the middle game. Moving back and forth. Magnus Carlsen is just insane. Gives up the b7 pawn. Knight here, check. King goes back. He moves his bishop back to f6. Rook to b5. And now somehow the knights are jumping around. Magnus has to be very careful. He loses another pawn. Check, king c1. And now gives another check. Gives a check. Trades off the knights. Eases out his position. He has 2 pawns on the king side. Hans Niemann has just 1 pawn. He moves rook c5. Bishop goes back. Can Hans's a pawn be dangerous? Magnus puts his rook behind the pawn and starts pushing his own pawns. This is just brilliant. Hans brings the knight back. The rook comes to attack the knight. And what to do next? He plays rook c5 with just 1 second on the clock. Rook c6 attacking the bishop. Takes. He moves his king. And now Magnus knows he's winning this. Look at him. Super zoned in. The rook stops the a pawn. The 2 kingside pawns are absolutely powerful. Rook goes back. Hans knows that the writing is on the wall. He's lost this. He resigns. Magnus Carlsen wins. And look at that expression, as if